The Middle East was hit with over 1,000 years of drought. It was caused by a short ice age called the Younger Dryas, which brought glaciers to Europe and famine to the Fertile Crescent. It was a climate catastrophe. Deep in the sand and suffering, the hunters changed their way of life. Some people escaped to the few oases with water and good soil. Here, they learnt to plant crops and became the world's first farmers. Others searched desperately for game across their traditional hunting lands, but the drought made the animals scarce. To save themselves, they were the very first domesticated farm animals. Archaeologist Melinda Zader is tracking the way goats changed as they were domesticated. Her evidence comes from a huge collection of bones gathered from across the entire Middle East. The changes are most obvious in the horns.
You can see on this big guy here from the highlands of Iran, a wild Bezor goat. He's got a very large horn. It's sharply keeled. It's rounded in its sort of profile here. And it goes back in what they call a scimitar shape. And this is very distinctive of the wild goat. It's quite different from what we see in this fellow here, this domestic goat, where the horn is now flattened on the inside, it's twisted, and obviously it's quite a bit smaller. Now the reason for that is that in the wild, this kind of a horn gives the males a competitive advantage in competing for females. In the domestic situation, the males aren't competing for females, but the herder is selecting who breeds with whom. So there's really no need for this large equipment.
Today in the Middle East, people are still herding goats in the same way. The first herders selected smaller and less aggressive animals, removing the very traits the animals needed to survive in the wild. In return, the herders provided food and protection. They soon added other animals to their herds. This one small part of the world supplied almost all our domesticated species. Alongside goats and sheep were pigs. This pottery figure from Turkey is 8,000 years old. Cows were early beasts of burden.
We tend to look at domestication of animals as a big lose-lose situation for the animals. But really, from a Darwinian perspective, it's a big win-win, because domestic animals, through their collaboration with humans, are able to outcompete their wild progenitors. For the humans, obviously, they're obtaining resources, either plant or animal. It may not be as nutritious or even as necessarily as bountiful a diet as they were getting from hunting and gathering. But there is an element of security and predictability that this kind of resource provides.
For the herders, it was a brilliant idea. By keeping the animals alive and breeding them, they guaranteed the supply of meat. These new villages bustled with life. They had plenty of food. Now some people could be freed from the grind of farming. They developed their talents into specialized jobs. Knife makers collected special rose-colored flint for their finest blades. The first potters learnt to make containers from clay, which was dried in the sun. Archaeologists have found the remains of baskets intended for trade. Some were sealed with a lining made with clay or bitumen. Other baskets were woven from local grasses and reeds for a host of different tasks. The same skills were used to develop the first woven fabrics. To do this, they created perhaps the earliest piece of complex technology ever devised. They designed the first looms, still found in villages today. They developed a soft cloth from native flax and made linen. Households grew to take in extended families. Kitchens were separated from bedrooms, and the need for privacy was growing.
The architecture goes way beyond what you need just for simple shelter. People are using architecture, just like modern architects use architecture, to express ideas about not just form and volume and so forth, but about how the world is and how we should live in it and how we relate to that world. They're creating an artificial built environment.
They paid as much attention to the beauty of their domestic objects.
For the first time in human history, we're seeing people who behave like us. They do it because they can. It makes a richer life, it makes a richer world, it makes for deeper understanding. I think we underestimate just homemaking. For us, it's a very deeply felt need, so deeply felt that mostly we don't think about it. But what we're seeing are the very first people who are engaging in that kind of activity where they're in the interior of their house, they're turning it into their little home.
9,000 years ago, they invented the first artificial building material. Smooth, clean, and waterproof, it was instantly popular. Plaster.
I don't think it's entirely utilitarian or functional. It's to do with ideas of home as opposed to just having a house to live in. It's making a place which has all sorts of formal and symbolic values attached to it, just indeed as the houses we live in have all sorts of ways, keys which tell you how you should behave in this room. Shall we eat in the kitchen? Very informal. Let's have supper in the dining room, and it's quite different.
Plaster was extremely versatile and turns up in many sites. In 1974, Jordanians digging a main road to Amman discovered the Stone Age ruins of Ain Ghazal. Here, Gary Rollofson was able to document on film the story of plaster.
What we're looking at is a Neolithic house with a beautiful plaster floor, with a central hearth for heating and for cooking and for light. The plaster is of excellent quality, very sophisticated.
Ain Ghazal was a large, impressive town with hundreds of houses. Plaster was part of its dazzle.
Every house had to have a lime plaster floor. That's expensive. It's expensive because lime does not exist as a natural resource. Lime has to be manufactured, and it's among the first artificial materials that were ever produced by humans. It comes from burning limestone. And in order to burn limestone, you have to reach high temperatures. The temperatures have to be sustained for long periods of time, and this requires a lot of fuel. Every time that you make a floor at these 50 square meter houses, we figure that you're using at least 6 trees.
In these houses, Roelofsen found evidence of a traditional burial. The plaster covered a body with no skull, a ritual developed 3,000 years earlier.
They buried the body beneath the floor and came back sometime later, opened up the burial pit again, and then removed the skull.
Bodies were also ritually exposed to birds of prey outside the town. Then they used building plaster in a new way to preserve images of the dead.
The face was recreated. A portrait was made of the deceased using plaster that was modeled and molded into those particular characteristics that identify grandfather from uncle from aunt. It's an ancestor veneration cult, if you will, that we have a sequence of these people who are being selected in order to establish this connection with the past, this connection with the land, and perhaps then the connection with the house. The Smiths, for example, will be able to trace their genealogy back from this ancestor to this ancestor to this ancestor, all the way back into time. Eventually, you come to this very dim past where even if there's a name out there, you're not really sure what the name means anymore. You get back into this mystical, foggy area of that's so far back in time that you're not really certain how the connections work anymore. These mystical ancestors, we think we found.
In the laboratory, researchers removed the rubble hiding the statues. After 8,000 years, they revealed life-size figures, just the way they were made. There's a gift for simplicity which takes these figures beyond the portraits of known ancestors.
Instead of being the real ancestors, we think they're the mythical ancestors of the people who lived at Ain Ghazal, if not in the entire region. We see at least 3 pairs of statues that have 2 heads. We already have the symbolism involved of the statues representing mythical ancestors altogether. What we're beginning to see is that we have the Ain Ghazal Smiths and the Jericho Smiths being represented in the same body. So we have 2 parts of the same line coming together symbolically.
These figures are tied into the spiritual life of the early farmers. The evidence for their religion is pieced together from fragments scattered across the region. Over 2,000 years, villagers had slowly changed the land.
Before villages got established, there was very little human impact on the environment at all. People were moving around. They didn't stay in one place for very long. They didn't have the opportunity to impact the environment. But now, as people are settled in one place, the impacts they do have can build on each other, and they can continue to affect the environment generation after generation after generation.
At Ain Ghazal, Roelofsen found evidence of the crisis in the wooden posts that held up their roofs.
The posts that started out at up to 60 centimeters in diameter decrease gradually in size, and we think this reflects the absolute decrease in large trees that are in close proximity to Ain Ghazal itself.
Then the plaster began to suffer, even though they loved it.
It appears to be a mixture of mud and perhaps pounded chalk. I suspect that this represents, again, the lack of available fuel for the use of plaster manufacture. And in fact, in the hearths that the people are using for cooking their food, wood is no longer found. The remains of wood charcoal is no longer found. Instead, they were using animal dung as the fuel.
All the available wood grew on the nearby hills. Slowly, it became harder and harder to reach. Eventually, the supply could not keep up.
There is a deforestation that's radiating out away from the center of the settlement, and wood that should be renewable as a resource. But now we come into this problem with goats. One of the things that goats love are brush, and probably the sweetest brush there is a sapling or seedling. And so this is irreversible deforestation. As long as you keep goats around there, those trees are never going to grow back.
For the first time, human communities were destroyed by environmental collapse, which they themselves had caused.
Population at Ain Ghazal dropped, it plummeted from what may have been its height at 3,000, perhaps even more, down to several hundred people.
Towns like Ain Ghazal were finally abandoned. The archaeological record almost disappears after 2,500 years of settlement. Many of the survivors were forced to become nomadic herders ranging across the exposed highlands. It would take another 1,000 years before farmers found a way to survive in this landscape again. Between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, colonizing farmers spread out from the Middle East through Turkey and into southern Europe. The journeys were pioneered by traders who made sea voyages in small boats. Now the farmers set out with some seeds, a few animals, and the idea of farming. They found a vast continent. They faced the challenge of a new landscape and a new climate. The forest was impenetrable, so they moved up the major rivers.
They're coming in very small numbers into a continent that is already inhabited. So there are lots of people already living there, and it's not as if there was a great frontier of movement and all the natives are being cleared out of the way. These first farmers are really inserting themselves around the much more powerful established communities who are already present. And these Mesolithic natives, the hunters and gatherers whose ancestors had been living there since the Ice Age, were probably there in much greater numbers.
The hunter-gatherers living here never found grains which could be farmed, or the right herd animals to domesticate. The shift to farming just hadn't been possible.
One of the traps we have to avoid, I think, is that we shouldn't think that people back in those times were dumber, not so bright, not so intelligent. So far as we know, they had brains exactly like ours. And if they survived in the conditions in which they lived, they were probably a lot smarter on their feet than most of us are today.
When we say farming, let's be very clear what is moving into Europe at this time, because the image of farmers is one that has many contemporary resonances which are really quite irrelevant. These are simple peasants who are using only a basic range of crops. They were settling in small patches of land that were appropriate for growing the crops that they brought with them, and they were constantly adapting to this new environment. But they were also changing it because they were moving into a forested environment, and forests don't allow crops to grow.
To the early farmers, the forest must have been a fearful place. It was easy to get lost. There were bears and wolves. Perhaps the forest had its own spirits. In Europe, the advancing farmers were still trying to use methods from the Middle East. But this world was very different.
A lot of the technologies needed to be rethought. You needed to work out ways of constructing houses purely out of timber instead of out of the mud that you'd used previously. You needed to work out ways of dealing with dense forest.
As they moved north, they moved into a European climate. The seasons were much more extreme. Here, farming seemed to be impossible. For 1,000 years, they had no answer to winter. They could go no further. Finally, they succeeded, breaking through with a complete rethink of their farming methods. They realized that timing was critical and worked out exactly when to plant, how to grow and harvest before the winter. They learned how to use poorer soils.
So now farming is spreading to a whole range of soils which are not so productive, and therefore you need to clear more and more and more of the woodland in order to get the same sorts of yield from these poorer soils. And so the plough arrives as the solution to a problem.
With a plough, the farmers could cultivate much larger areas. It dug deeper to turn over these heavy northern soils. It was a new and uniquely European farming lifestyle, and it spread with amazing speed.
I think one of the reasons why it seems to spread so rapidly, it is astonishingly fast, it's like dropping a match in a pile of dry hay. And the dry hay is the problem, the fact that the farmers are having to cultivate more and more land with their own efforts.
They changed so much, they created a new way of life. Archaeologists call them the Longhouse people. They lived together with their animals in these huge communal buildings. Massive forest timbers, whole trees, held up the roof. Their possessions revealed a new kind of conformity. They all used one kind of axe. They had one style of pottery incised with lines. Perhaps it was the only way for Stone Age farmers to absorb so much change and finally adapt to a new landscape. In only 300 years, farmers had spread east to Russia and west to northern France. The continent was dotted with cleared fields. The face of Europe had changed forever.